Hey guys, in the previous lesson, we have introduced MasterPi PC software. This lesson, we're going to learn how to program an action group. I will create an action group to realize grab the block and then place it on the left side. Before setting the action group, you can think about how to program this action in advance. The action we're going to program consists of 12 steps. Set the initial posture first. Let the robotic arm down. Move too close to the block. Open the gripper. Move to the block. Grip the block. Move the robotic arm up. Move the block to the left side. Lower the color block. Release the block. Move the robotic arm up. Back to the initial posture. Now follow me to program the action group. Click Open Action File. Select Start as the initial posture. Then click the black triangle in front of the number 1 action to update the ID value to the servo control area. Drag the slider of ID 5 servo to move the robotic arm down to the colored block. Then running time is set to 1200 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and the time is set to 300 milliseconds. Then drag the sliders of ID 4 and ID 5 servos to make the robotic arm close to the block. The time is set to 800 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and set the running time to 200 milliseconds. Now drag the slider of ID 1 to let the gripper open. And set the time to 400 milliseconds. Then add a transition action. Next, drag the slider of ID 3 and ID 5 servos to let the robotic arm grip the block. And set the time to 800 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and set the time to 200 milliseconds. Drag the slider of ID 1 servo to let the robotic arm move the block up. And set the time to 300 milliseconds. Then add a transition action. Drag the slider of ID 5 servo and set the time to 1000 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and set the time to 300 milliseconds. Drag the slider of ID 6 to move the block to the left side and set the time to 1500 milliseconds. Then add a transition action. Drag the slider of ID 5 servo to move the block down. And set the time to 800 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and set the time to 300 milliseconds. Drag the slider of ID 1 servo to release the block. And set the time to 400 milliseconds. Then add a transition action. Drag the slider of ID 5 and ID 1 servos. And set the time to 500 milliseconds. Then add a transition action and set the time to 300 milliseconds. Finally, click the black triangle in front of number 1 action to lag the robotic arm back to the initial posture and set the time to 1500 milliseconds. Then add it as the last action. Now the action has been programmed. Then click Run to run the action group. If you want to modify the action, you can modify the selected action directly in Action Data List, and then press Enter to save it. Finally, save the action file for future debugging. Click Save Action File and name the file. The name must be English name to avoid error. Okay, this is the end of the video. Please have a try.